As we know, the Premier has locked down the state of Victoria because it's all our fault, he said. Not his government's and certainly not his. Lots to get into to discuss this and a whole lot more. I'm joined now by the Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan from Melbourne. Well, I tell you what, Greg, hotel bungling, 30,000 protesters, all about complacency, our complacency, the Premier said today. What went through your mind as you listened to the press conference from the Premier mid-afternoon?
Well, Peter, fantastic to be with you. A couple of things, really. One is Daniel Andrews speaks well. He's got a very plausible manner, but he doesn't take responsibility for anything. I mean, this has happened in Melbourne. It hasn't happened anywhere else in Australia. He was the most authoritarian Premier, imposing the most severe lockdown. And he ran a government which was most incompetent at running quarantine hotels. So he's telling everybody, if you go shopping, people will die. No pair of shoes is worth a life. And yet he didn't pay enough attention to quarantine hotels, even to put police or military in charge of them, even if you use security guards for the bulk of people. And now he's punted that off to a judicial inquiry, and that means he doesn't have to ask a single question of it. The ABC, of course, doesn't subject state politics to any scrutiny, so he just gets away without any consequence. Then 30,000 people, however many it was, came to the Black Lives Matters demonstration. If you shop, people will die, never translated to if you demonstrate, people will die. And of course, just a few weeks after the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, we got these outbreaks. And who would know what the actual connections were? Although certainly people concluded if you can have 10,000 people gather in the city, you can have 10 people gather in my home. This is really a catastrophic failure by the Andrews government. And it's a weakness in Australia's political culture that state governments seem to be able to get away with this level of poor performance without suffering any real political consequences.
Well, I think this may well be the beginning of the end of Daniel Andrews. I'd argue he was probably looking to go at some time anyway. He's relatively young. He's had, unquestionable power. He's probably done all he thinks he can do in state politics. What I don't understand, though, Greg, and I've worked inside the system, is you get a scare like Ruby Princess that would have put every other state administration on its mettle, on notice, to say, the Peter Credlin in the Premier's office and everyone would have sat down and said, are we sure we've got belts and braces on our processes? Do we have everything we need at health level, at police level, to ensure this won't happen in our state? So everyone saw the consequences of having lack processes down the line. Yet in Victoria, once the disease was suppressed, the only entry point was going to be returning travellers. So you would think that's where they would have put their entire attention. But they didn't put police there, they didn't put the ADF there, they put private contractors, and we know it was a complete and utter shambolic operation. How did they get it so wrong?
Well, Peter, you've summed the situation up perfectly. It's almost unbelievable. Now, there are some stories, I don't know if they're true or not, that unions objected to having the ADF because they thought that would take union members' jobs. I do think the poor old security guards are the innocent patsies in this. They got zero training or 30 seconds training. I mean, anyone who knows the security business, close family members of mine have worked part-time in security when they've been going through university. Basically, security guards get no training anyway. They're told just to look intimidating and don't do anything. And then this was a specialist role involving the strict use of protective personal equipment, involving restraining people who had, come back from high-stress journeys overseas and didn't want to be in lockdown for 2 weeks in a hotel, and all the rest of it. They were given no training. They were not properly paid. The companies that the Victorian government engaged then subcontracted even less well-paid and less qualified people to do the job. And there was no ongoing training. So you didn't say, well, we've got to get these people in place on day one, but we'll train 10% of them on day two and another 10% on day three. Now, this was from a government which had a regime which meant you could get fined $1,600 for taking your daughter on a driving lesson or for going to Bunnings store when Bunnings was open, in which the Premier used the most morally absolute language you could imagine. So this has got to be one of the most catastrophic failures of basic government competence we've ever seen in Australia. And as a result, now we've got hundreds and perhaps thousands of virus cases throughout Victoria, with all of the terrible consequences. And yet it's as if this doesn't matter. I mean, Andrews doesn't miss a beat.
Yeah, well, there was no apology today, Greg. That's what I thought was damning of the Premier. You know, Peter Beattie would have got out there and apologised. There was no apology. And I, particularly on Sunday, I went for a drive and went around the Housing Commission area. It's very close to where I live. I live in an apartment building, so I understand what it would be like in some way to have your front door shut and not be able to leave the corridor. Now, I don't understand how he gets away with shutting down public housing when there wasn't, and I've demonstrated with the numbers tonight, a great outbreak in those tenancies at all. How is it that they can lose their liberty like this? And the ABC and Julian Burnside, no one seems to be questioning it.
Well, I probably have a little more sympathy for the idea of shutting down the public housing units. They are a terrible, monstrous crime against human architecture, those buildings. And luckily we didn't do too many of them in Australia, but they have these tiny little lifts, very, very narrow corridors,